This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. And during that time, he reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a royal banquet for all of his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Media and Persia, the princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed his vast wealth and the splendor and glory of his majesty. And when these days were over, he gave another banquet, lasting 7 days, for all of the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. The enclosed gardens of the palace had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of silver and gold on a mosaic pavement of marble, porphyry, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. And wine was served in golden goblets, each different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way, for the king had instructed all the wine stewards to serve each guest whatever he wished. And Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of the king. On the 7th day, when the king was in high spirits from the wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Zathar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty for all the people and the nobles, for she was very lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the message to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. Then King Xerxes became angry and burned with fury. As it was custom in those days for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, the king spoke to the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? He asked. For she has refused to obey the commands of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Well, then Mclean responded to the king in the presence of the king and in all the nobles, saying, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but against all the nobles and against the peoples of all the provinces of the king. For the queen's behavior will become known to all the women, and they will despise their husbands, and they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she wouldn't come. This very day, all the Persian and Median women of nobility who have heard of the queen's conduct will respond to the king's nobles in the same way. Well, there will be no end to the disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a decree and let it be written in the laws of Media and Persia that Queen Vashti is never again to enter the king's presence. And let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. And then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. Well, this advice pleased the king and his nobles, and so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man was to be ruler of his own household. Later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants suggested, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. And let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his vast realm to bring these beautiful girls into the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. And then let the girl who pleases the king be made queen instead of Vashti. Well, this advice appealed to the king, so he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried away into captivity from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Among those taken captive was Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Now Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up since she had neither father nor mother. This girl, also known as Esther, was lovely in form and feature, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the order and edict of the king was proclaimed, many beautiful girls were brought into the citadel of Susa, and Esther also was placed in the royal palace of the king and put under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem. And the girl won his favor. Immediately, he provided beauty treatments for her and special foods. He assigned to her 7 maids selected from the king's palace and moved her and her maids to the best part of the harem. Now Esther had not yet revealed her family background and origin, for Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day, Mordecai walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a girl's turn came to go before the king, she had to undergo 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women. 6 months with oil of myrrh, and 6 months with perfume and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her to take with her from the harem to the palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning, she would return to another part of the harem, to the care of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king's presence unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther to go before the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Teves, in the 7th year of his reign. And King Xerxes was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her and made Esther queen instead of Vashti. He gave a royal banquet for all of his nobles and officials and distributed gifts with royal liberality. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had not revealed her family background and origin, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow his instructions just as she had done as he was bringing her up. During the time that Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officials who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai overheard the plot and told it to Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were hanged on the gallows. All of this was recorded in the book of Annals in the presence of the king. After that time, the king honored Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and placing him on a seat of honor higher than that of any other noble or official. All the king's officials at the king's gate knelt down and gave honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. The royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's commands?" Day after day they spoke to him, but Mordecai refused to comply. So they told Haman about it, to see if Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai neither knelt down nor paid him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, Haman scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's family, the Jews, throughout the entire kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of the reign of King Xerxes, in the first month, they cast the pour, which is the lot, in the presence of Haman to determine a day and a month. And the lot fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. And Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people, scattered and dispersed among the peoples of your vast provinces, whose customs are different than those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. Therefore, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 pieces of silver in the royal treasury for the men who will carry this out." The king removed his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," he said, "and do with the people as you please." Then, on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. And they wrote in the script of all the peoples and in the language of all the provinces all the orders of Haman to the king's satraps, the governors, and the nobles of the various provinces. These were written in the name of the king and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the provinces with the orders to kill, annihilate, and destroy all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in all the provinces and made known to the people of all nationalities so that they would be ready on that day. Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out to all the provinces, and this edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. When Mordecai heard of all that had been done, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the city streets, wailing loudly and bitterly. In every province to which the order and edict of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in the streets in sackcloth and ashes. When the eunuchs and maids of Esther came to her and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent to him clothes to wear instead of the sackcloth, but he would not accept them. So Esther summoned Hathach, the king's eunuch who was assigned to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what is troubling him and why. So Hathach met with Mordecai at the king's gate. And Mordecai told him everything that had been done to him, including the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave to him a copy of the text of the edict to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told him to urge her to go before the king and plead with him for her people. So Hathach returned to Queen Esther and reported to her everything Mordecai had said. Then Esther instructed him to say this to Mordecai: "All the royal officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who goes into the presence of the king without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception to this is if the king were to extend to him his gold scepter and spare his life. But it has been 30 days since I have been called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent this response: "Do not think that because you live in the king's house, that you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will come from another source, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you were brought to royal position for such a time as this?" So Esther responded, Go and gather all the Jews who are in the city of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink anything for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king's presence, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went out and carried out all of Esther's instructions. And on the 3rd day, Esther dressed herself in her royal robes and went and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was seated on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. And when he saw Esther, he was pleased with her and extended to her his royal scepter. Esther approached and touched the tip of it. What is it, Queen Esther? He asked. Anything you want, and it will be given to you, even up to half the kingdom. If it pleases the king, Esther responded, let the king and Haman come to a banquet today that I will prepare for them. Bring Haman at once, the king ordered, so that we may do what Esther has asked. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking their wine, the king asked Esther, now, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It will be given to you, even up to half the kingdom, and it will be granted. Then Esther responded, my petition and my request is this. If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor with the king, let the king together with Haman come tomorrow to a banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Well, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But then he saw Mordecai sitting at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence. And so Haman was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends, he boasted about his vast wealth and his many sons, and all the ways that the king had elevated him above all the other nobles. And that is not all, he added. For I am the only person Queen Esther has invited to come to the banquet she prepared for the king. And she's invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all of this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Ugh. Well, then Zeresh, his wife, and his friends said to him, have a gallows built 75 feet high, and then in the morning go to the king and ask him to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go to dinner with the king and be happy. Well, this advice delighted Haman, and so he had the gallows built. That night, the king could not sleep, and so he ordered the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who had conspired to assassinate the king. What honor and recognition has been given to Mordecai for this? The king asked. Well, nothing has been done for him, the attendants answered. The king said, well, who is in the court? Well, now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak with the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had built for him. So the attendants answered, Mordecai is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. And when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Well, now Haman thought to himself, Who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, saying, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring in a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, one with the royal crest on its head. And then have the robe and the horse entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. And then have them robe the man and lead him on the streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman, and do everything you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you've recommended. So Mordecai got the robe and the horse, and Haman got the robe and the horse. How weird is that? Haman got the robe and the horse, and he robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Afterwards, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman returned home with his head covered in grief, and he told Zeresh's wife and all of his friends everything that had happened to him. Well, then Zeresh's wife and his advisors all said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you can't stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. While they were still talking to him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet that Esther had prepared. So Haman and the king went to the banquet of Queen Esther. And a second time, while they were drinking wine a second time, the king asked Esther, now, what is your request? Anything you ask will be given to you, even up to half the kingdom, and it will be granted. And Esther answered, if I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases your majesty to grant my request, grant me my life, this is my petition, and spare my people, this is my request. For I and my people have been sold into destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, for no such distress justifies disturbing the king. Well, then King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who has done this? Who would dare do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. Well, then Haman was terrified in the presence of the king and the queen. The king rose in a rage, left his wine, and went out to the royal palace garden. But Haman, realizing the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. And just as the king was returning from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling across the couch where Esther was reclining. And the king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? As the words were coming out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who attended the king, said, a gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He had it built for Mordecai, who spoke up to save the king. And the king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. and the anger of the king subsided. That same day, King Xerxes gave to Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told him how he was related to her. And the king took the signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai head of Haman's estate. Then Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping, begging him to undo the evil plans of Haman the Agagite that he had devised against the Jews. And the king extended to her his royal scepter, and Esther arose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favor, and if it seems the right thing to do, and if he's pleased with me, then let issue an order undoing the plans of Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he devised against the Jews to destroy them in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see the destruction of my people? How can I bear to see disaster fall on my family?" Then the king replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, saying, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Queen Esther and have hanged him on the gallows. Now, write another order in my name and in behalf of all the Jews as seems best to you, and seal it with my ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring can be revoked." Immediately, all the royal secretaries were summoned, and they wrote in the script of each people and in the language of each province all of Mordecai's orders to the Jews, to the satraps, to the governors, and to the nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes and sealed the dispatches with the king's ring, and sent them on mounted couriers who rode fast horses especially bred for the king. The king's edict gave the Jews the right to assemble and to protect themselves, to kill, destroy, and annihilate any armed forces from any nationality or province that might attack them or their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The appointed day for the Jews to do this was on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in all the provinces and made known to the people of all nationalities, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. Mordecai left the king's presence that day wearing a royal robe of blue and white and a robe of fine purple linen. In the citadel of Susa, they gave a celebration. For the Jews, it was a time of joy and gladness, and they celebrated with feasting and celebration. Many people of different nationalities became Jews, for the fear of the Jews had seized them. The book of Esther, chapters 1 through 8, the word of the Lord to his people.